The seven sages numbered 22, weirdly enough, and were as follows. And now, please forgive me if I butcher any of these names. I've learned them in Italian and not quite sure how they would be pronounced in English. So, here goes. Thales, Pittacus, Bias, Solon, Cleobulus, Chilon, Periander, Myson, Aristodemus, Epimenides, Leophantus, Pythagoras, Anarchasis, Epicharmus, Acusilaus, Orpheus, Pisistratus, Pherecydes, blimey, Cambrinus of Hermione, well, however it's pronounced, Lasus, Pamphilus, and Anaxagoras. It's not really surprising that there are so many sages are named in the sacred books. The reason is simply that the historians of philosophy never really managed to agree about whom to include. To be fair, they agreed about the first four, Thales, Pittacus, Bias, and Solon, who might therefore be considered the key players of the team. But when it came to making up the side to 7, they had at least 18 reserves to call on. Apart from anything else, there was always someone ready to make an illegal substitution when no one was looking and slip in a friend, maybe even a prominent politician. Much as if I had been asked to compile a list of the 7 sages today, were to include the Prime Minister for the sake of flattery. These sages were all men of few words, laconic as one might say. Knowing keeps silence. Shun the hasty word. Be avid to listen but not to speak. Let not your tongue outrun your thought, are all sayings which give the impression of an age when wisdom and reticence went hand in hand. For their gift of briefness, maybe, we should dub the sages the inventors of the proverb. Many of their maxims are still in use. Cleobulus, mate with one of your rank, corresponds to the Italian saying, moglie boi dei paesi tuoi, which literally translated, take your wife and your oxen from your own neighborhood, but, well, it's a bit lost in translation, as you might imagine. Thanks to their axioms, or wise sayings, the fame of the 7 sages spread from one place to another, until, even without the help of mass media, everyone in the Greek world knew all about Thales and his companions. Their axioms were used by fathers for the education of their sons, and orators quoted them liberally in their speeches, both before the assembly and in tribunal. Their songs were sung at banquets and were, quite differently from the Eurovision songs, full of high moral content. Of song of Chilon's I particularly remember has the refrain, by the whetstone gold is tried, and by gold is the mind of men brought to test. If I had to pick a favourite of these 22, I'd probably go for Pittacus of Mytilene. He was not only a wise man, but also an admirable military commander, and when he gave office, the people of Mytilene presented him with a large tract of land and christened it Pitacha in his honour. But Pittacus, having no desire to become a great landowner, accepted only as much land as was necessary to supply his own needs, justifying his decision by declaring that half was more than the whole. Here are some of the most striking maxims of Pittacus of Mytilene. Do not announce your plans beforehand, for if they fail, you will be ridiculed. It is hard to be good. The earth is trustworthy, the sea untrustworthy. And, most striking of all, suffer minor disturbances from your neighbour. There is a story told about the 7 sages that is too illuminating and, let's say, entertaining, to even want to check whether it's authentic or not. One day, apparently, the 7 wise men decided to take a trip into the countryside, and all agreed to meet at Delphi at the shrine of the oracle of Apollo. Here they were received with all due honour by the eldest of the priests, who, seeing the Gotha of Greek wisdom gathered around him, immediately decided to take advantage of the occasion by inviting each one to carve a saying on the temple wall. The first to agree was Chilon of Sparta, who got himself a ladder and wrote over the main door the famous phrase, "Know thyself." One by one, the others followed suit. Cleobulus and Periander, one to the right and the other to the left of the main entrance, wrote they celebrated epigrams, "Moderation is best," and "Tranquility is the most beautiful thing in the world." Solon, out of modesty, chose a little dark corner in the peristyle and wrote, "Learn to obey, and you will learn to command." Thales inscribed his words on the outer walls of the temple, so that pilgrims approaching the shrine along the sacred path should be able, as soon as they had rounded the corner of the altars of the Chios, to read, "Remember your friends." Pittacus, ever the eccentric, knelt down at the foot of the Python's tripod and sculpted the obscure phrase, "Restore what had been entrusted to you." When these had all been done, the only one remaining was Bias of Priene, and much to everyone's surprise, he drew back, muttering that he didn't feel like it and actually didn't know what to write, basically making excuses. The others gathered round him and made suggestions, but in spite of their encouragement, Bias seemed determinedly reluctant to participate. The more they said, "Come on, Bias, you are the wisest of us. Leave a trace of your illumination for future visitors," and all these platitudes. "Listen, my friends, it would be much better if I were to write nothing," he would counter. They argued, and eventually wore the poor sage down to the point where he couldn't no longer refuse. And it was then that he reached for the stylus with a trembling hand and he wrote. Okay, made it a bit dramatic, but "Most men are bad." Now, read in haste, this phrase seems harmless enough, and yet this statement of Bias represents the most dramatic judgment ever expressed in Greek philosophy. "Most men are bad" is a bomb capable of destroying any ideology. It's like going to the supermarket and taking a tin of baked beans from the bottom of a great pyramid of tins of baked beans. They all fall down. The very principle of democracy is here undermined. Universal suffrage, Marxism, Christianity, and every other doctrine based upon the love of one's neighbour. I know that our self-pride naturally refuses to accept the pessimism of Bias, yet, deep down, the suspicion stirs that maybe the old madman was actually right. Anyone who has been to a football match knows what a crowd is really like, and in ancient Rome, it wasn't chance but common sense that put the fate of the defeated gladiator into the hands of the emperor alone, and never into those of the spectators, for this mass would invariably have given the thumbs down. The Civis Romanos went along to the Colosseum with his entire family precisely in order to see as many men killed as possible. And this, making all due allowances, is still true today. That man is the cruelest of all living things is not, I think, a matter for debate. There is another possible interpretation of Bias' statement, though, that most men are bad when acting en masse. In other words, single human beings may be good individually, and only become transformed into wild animals when acting as a mass. In the 5th century BC, an anonymous Athenian, possibly a refugee or an outcast, wrote a pamphlet in the format of a discussion between two citizens, airing their opinions about the new democratic regime in Athens. One says, "In the best man, you can find the minimum of unruliness and injustice, and the maximum inclination towards goodness, whereas among the masses, you find the maximum degree of ignorance, disorderliness, and wickedness, given that poverty induces ignominy, and from this comes the unmannerliness and brutality that have their source in indigence." This passage is possibly the earliest criticism of the democratic system, and it is interesting to note that the author, although a dyed-in-the-wool reactionary, does not blame the people who he says try to help each other as much as those who, although they are not themselves of the people, choose to operate in a city governed by the masses rather than by the best, because they know that their own lasciviousness would be better concealed here than in an oligarchy. To return to the seven sages, one thing I have learned is that we should always be highly wary when dealing with wisdom, for it is often deliberately at variance with idealism. Wisdom is no more than common sense, a sound knowledge about the world, whereas idealism is the irresistible desire to believe in a better future. Wisdom speaks of men as they really are. Idealism imagines them as they could be. Two different ways of looking at the world, and the choice is up to each of us.